Recently, President Joe Biden secured a 10-year security agreement with Ukraine, signed by Volodymyr Zelensky. This agreement, classified as an executive agreement rather than a treaty, bypassed congressional approval, raising concerns about its binding nature on future administrations. Unlike treaties, which require a two-thirds Senate majority and are legally binding, executive agreements rest solely on the incumbent president's authority. Additionally, Zelensky's legitimacy as a signatory is questionable under Ukraine's constitution, suggesting he may have been misled about the accord's enduring validity and authority. Yeah, it's basically a con.
Welcome to TFI Global, the antidote to mass delusion.
At the recent G7 summit, US President Joe Biden secured a 10-year security agreement with Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky, whose presidential term, by the way, ended on May 20th. This deal, hailed as historic by the White House, faces an uncertain future, according to the US media. The agreement is classified as an executive agreement, not a treaty, as Biden bypassed congressional approval. Treaties require a two-thirds Senate majority to become legally binding international agreements. In contrast, executive agreements are made by the president alone and do not necessarily obligate his successors. Understanding the distinction between treaties and executive agreements is crucial in US law and international diplomacy. Let's get to the technicalities. Treaties, by definition, are formally ratified agreements between sovereign states. The constitutional basis is Article 2, Section 2 of the US Constitution, which allows the President to make treaties with the advice and consent of the Senate. Talking about the legal status, once ratified, treaties become part of the US law under the Supremacy Clause, Article 6, Clause 2 of the Constitution, making them the supreme law of the land. And the binding nature, treaties are binding on future administrations unless abrogated through Senate approval or terminated according to the treaty's terms. And executive agreements, a definition is international agreement made by the president without Senate approval. Its constitutional basis is not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution. That is, executive agreement, is implied by the president's foreign affairs powers, Article 2, Section 1. Talking about the legal status, it's based on existing treaties, statutory authority, or the president's constitutional powers. They do not require Senate approval and are not necessarily binding on subsequent administration. Let's talk about the types. Congressional executive agreements, approved by a simple majority in both houses of Congress, often used for trade deals like NAFTA. Sole executive agreements made by the president alone, typically addressing temporary or limited issues. The fragility of executive agreements is evident from historical precedents. For instance, President Donald Trump dismantled the Iran nuclear deal, JCPOA, in 2018, an executive agreement originally deemed historic in 2015. This example underscores the vulnerability of executive agreements to changes in administration. Recent polls from YouGov, Yahoo News, and Emerson indicate that Trump is leading Biden in the 2024 presidential race, including in key battleground states. Even if, and that's nearly impossible, Biden secures a second term, his presidency will end in 2029, leaving the fate of the 10-year agreement dependent on his successor. Treaties, although requiring Senate approval, are also subject to unilateral presidential action. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter withdrew from the 1954 Mutual Defense Treaty with Taiwan. Similarly, President George W. Bush exited the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty with Russia in 2002. Other notable examples of treaty withdrawals include: number 1, Paris Agreement 2017. President Donald Trump announced the US withdrawal from this stupid climate change accord effective November 2020. Number 2, Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces or INF Treaty 2019. President Trump withdrew from this Cold War era agreement with Russia, which prohibited certain land based missiles. Number 3, Iran nuclear deal, which we discussed earlier. Trump exited the agreement aimed at limiting Iran's nuclear program in exchange for lifting economic sanctions. Number 4, Treaty of Amity with Iran 2018. Trump terminated this 1955 treaty, which established economic and consular relations between the two countries. Number 5, Open Skies Treaty. Trump withdrew from this agreement following reconnaissance flights over member countries to collect data on military forces and activities. Finally, the legitimacy of Zelensky as a signatory to the agreement is questionable. Under Ukraine's constitution, the presidential term is limited to 5 years, with no extensions allowed under even martial law. Thus, without a clarification from Ukraine's constitutional court, Zelensky's authority to sign the deal remains dubious and in doubt. The implication of these distinctions and historical precedents emphasize the urgent need to understand the differing legal frameworks and potential fragility of such international agreements, what I called it earlier, an elaborate con job.